Hi everyone, how's everyone doing? So I'm talking about the different types of loss and that you can suffer from. And I've talked about losing someone through a terminal illness. I've also talked about losing someone through suicide. And this third installment that I'm going to talk about is losing someone either through an accident or through them being killed. So this is another one which is really, really hard to navigate, and it would come under complicated grief. So complicated grief just means that it's grieving that is possibly going to take a lot longer than the normal grief journey. So this could be people that are either having counselling or grieving for many, many years, because they're having to go through a process which is probably a lot different from the normal grief stages. So if someone dies because of old age, or if someone dies because you have an opportunity to prepare mentally, so say they do have like a terminal illness, or that they maybe have an illness which they know from birth is they've been told that you probably will live to a certain age. You have time to almost mentally prepare. It doesn't mean that makes things any easier. It doesn't mean that means the loss of that person is any less painful. But when someone is, you see them in the morning or you see them on that day and everything's fine, your day is fine, and then you get a call to say that person has either been in an accident and then they've been killed from that, or whether they've been killed through domestic abuse or, just murdered in other ways, you don't see that coming. So it's the shock factor, meaning that your life changes overnight, really, or just changes within that few seconds. Now, no one's brain is ready to prepare for that. So that's why this type of grief is, you first have to overcome the barrier of the shock factor. And the people in these situations spend a lot more time in denial, because all they can vision is the person they saw at that moment, that morning, or whatever it is. So when they get the call isn't sinking in. And there's people who will either go and view the body as well, and it still won't sink in. So they'll be in a long stage of denial, and then after that they'll be in shock. So then they've got probably a few weeks or months to be in shock, and then after they've got through that, the denial and the shock, they then have to adjust to what's happened. And I think the difficulty there as well is you're going to have lots of other steps that are in place. So things like autopsies to be carried out. There's probably going to be investigations to see what's happened. There's going to be all sorts of things like maybe media attention, on this thing, if it's someone if it was unusual circumstances, or if it's someone well known. So you're dealing with all of that. So you don't have time to grieve when all that's going on, because you're having to answer questions from the police. You're having to wait for these investigations to happen. Maybe the things like arranging the funeral, you can't do that either, because there's probably a hold on that. So because you're having to suspend your grieving process, that's why it can become like a longer, lengthy period for grief, because by the time you've then buried that person, all sorts of things that you've had to put on hold are now coming to the light front. And then you're having to accept what's happened. And even that alone, accepting that someone has been killed, accepting that they died by an accident, whether it's an accident at work or another type of accident, you have to adjust to that. You have to make sense of it. So it can be really, really difficult to do that, and really challenging. I mean, I've not been in that situation myself, but I can't even imagine if I got a call saying that someone close to me has been killed, or that someone close to me has died through an accident, because it's kind of like you're not sitting there in life expecting that to happen. We know it happens, we know all sorts of things happen, but it is the shock. Your brain just isn't ready for it, because it's not something you've ever considered. So I think the biggest difficulty people would have is adjusting to their life after this, because of what has happened and how it's happened. So it's just, as I've said, it's prolonging all of these questions. Why did this happen? How did it happen? Who did this? Who's responsible? And then the other thing that people can do is, when they're having to take on maybe a company, if it was someone who died at work, or whether they're having to fight for, to get a police investigation, if it was through a murder, or if sometimes people are having to take on that cause themselves. They're having to go out there and do some of the questions, go out there and speak to the police and almost persuade them to look into this. That's another thing which puts your grief on hold, because you don't have time to process what's happened. You don't have time to be upset. You're busy trying to get this investigation started. So it can be really, really challenging, really tricky. It can take a lot out of the person. It can lead to the person who has had the loss becoming physically ill, becoming mentally ill, giving up on themselves because they're busy trying to fight for this justice for their loved one. I just can't even imagine it. But there are lots of people who have had to go through this. We've seen lots of cases in the media. We probably know people who have had to do this. I know people who've had to fight for justice for their loved ones. So yeah, it's the type of grief which you could say really that grief has had to be put on hold. So it just prolongs things. So in all of these situations that I spoke about, it's important that you consider the type of help you need and getting the support that you need, and whether that's through professionals or whether it's through like your places of worship, whether it's through people close to you. It's really important that you do get that support and get as much information as you can on, the stages of grief, so that you understand what you're experiencing, the tasks of mourning, so that you understand, this is not just you, this is like what a lot of people go through, and the needs of mourning, acknowledging that this is going to take long, acknowledging that you're going to need to give yourself time and space, acknowledging that, healing isn't going to happen overnight. In any type of grief, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a lengthy process. So I'd say that out of all the three that I've spoken about, all three of these cases are where grieving is, you could call it complicated grief, but you could also view it as being different from the different grieving processes. I hope you found these videos useful. If you have, feel free to just leave a comment. Other people might benefit from hearing what you have to say too. Thanks for watching. Bye.